Today's lecture is made possible by Hurdle Callahan and Company. Hurdle Callahan, founded in 1988, is committed to changing the investment industry through the forging of strong relationships. The integrity and service that Hurdle Callahan value are consistent with the ideals of Chautauqua, and we're so grateful for their support and for yours. Please join me in thanking all who support Chautauqua. Our guest concluding this week is practicing lawyer and scholar Theodore B. Olson. Mr. Olson served as Solicitor General of the United States from 2001 to 2004. Prior to that, he spent 4 years as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Office of Legal Counsel in the U.S. Department of Justice. Aside from these two intervals, he has been a lawyer with Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher since 1965. Selected by Time magazine in 2010 as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, Mr. Olson is one of the premier U.S. Supreme Court advocates. He's argued 62 cases in the Supreme Court and has prevailed in more than 75% of those arguments. Mr. Olson has also served as private counsel to two presidents, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. He has twice been awarded the United States Department of Justice's Edmund J. Randolph Award, its highest award for public service and leadership, and has also received the Department of Defense's Distinguished Service Award for his advocacy in the courts of the United States. Mr. Olson is involved with several national organizations, serving as a member of the Board of Trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, as a member of the Board of Visitors of the Federalist Society, among other groups. He's also a fellow of both the American College of Trial Lawyers and the American Academy of Appellate Lawyers. Mr. Olson received his bachelor's degree from the University of the Pacific and earned his law degree from the University of California at Berkeley. He's joined on this visit to Chautauqua by his wife, Lady Booth Olson, and his lecture this morning is titled, "The Supreme Court and the Future, from the 113th Justice Forward." I had the pleasure of hosting Ted and Lady at the President's Cottage earlier this week. In that reception, I introduced Ted by noting that his presence was symbolic of what we most hope for here at Chautauqua. He has tremendous conservative credentials and represented former President George W. Bush in the landmark Bush v. Gore case that ultimately brought President Bush to the Oval Office. But he was also the co-counsel for Hollingsworth v. Perry, which was the case that upheld the overturning of California's Proposition 8, banning same-sex marriages. His successful arguing of that case ushered in nationwide marriage rights for same-sex couples. And you might ask who his co-counsel was, David Boies, who represented Vice President Gore opposite him in the 2000 case. In this, in so many other ways, Ted Olson represents that human beings are not monolithic and don't fit neatly into any box. They are precisely something else, human. With those words and the acknowledgement that Chautauqua seeks to explore the very best of what it means to be human, please join me in welcoming Ted Olson back for his second address to the Chautauqua platform.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for being here. And I want to thank Shara Babcock for helping to bring me here, and the Hurdle Callahan Foundation, or company, for sponsoring this event. I'm very pleased today to be talking about the United States Supreme Court, one federal government institution of which we can reasonably be proud. Now, I could have drawn one of the other branches of government and had to talk about the presidency or Congress, but I got lucked out and I got the Supreme Court. It is true to be said that many of us are disheartened by the sorry state to which the two political branches of our government have sunk. Each is almost universally unpopular, and both are only marginally functional. The majority party in the House of Representatives and the Senate cannot agree with one another or itself on virtually any subject and has chosen not to work with the minority. For its part, the minority party has displayed remarkable unity in opposing anything and everything. Resist is the mantra, and political victories and next year's midterm elections seem to be all that matters in much of Washington. And where can I begin with the president? This is very sad. Nearly hourly displays of incompetence, divisiveness, distraction, petulance, and tantrum, and an utter incapacity, and it seems an unwillingness or disinterest even in governing. A substantial portion of the sub-cabinet and other executive branch officials are yet to be named. We're 6 months into this presidency. And when they are, the Senate minority has required cloture on 60% of the president's few nominees, requiring approximately, according to the New York Times, 3.5 days for every nominee approved. Our government is therefore being run by holdovers and acting officials. A constitutional republic that lasted 228 years through a civil war, economic depressions, and world wars has become helpless, hopeless, and hapless. In contrast, the Supreme Court stands out as a bulwark of strength, stability, consistency, and respectability. In times such as this, it is particularly important that all of us do whatever we can to keep the Supreme Court the way it is. We desperately need some portion of our government that we can trust, believe in, and rely on. The strength and stature of the Supreme Court today would have been something of a surprise to at least some of the framers of the Constitution. In Federalist 78, Hamilton famously referred to the judiciary as the least dangerous branch because it had no influence over either the sword or the purse. The judiciary, he said, is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. The first Chief Justice, John Jay, unhappy with the weakness of his positions and the burdens that accompany the job, resigned to run for governor of New York. Now, that's not a bad step, but he was not happy with the Supreme Court. When he was later reappointed a few years later in 1800 by President John Adams and confirmed by the Senate to be the third Chief Justice, all without his even knowledge. He was appointed and confirmed without even being told about it. He refused the post, saying that efforts to place the judicial department on a proper footing had proved fruitless. He was convinced, he said, that the system was so defective that the court would not and could not obtain the energy, weight, and dignity which was essential to affording to the national government the confidence and respect which, as the last resort of the justice system, the Supreme Court should possess. So he refused to accept the position of the Supreme Court when he was appointed in 1800. But ironically, that all began to change when John Jay declined that post and John Marshall was appointed in his place. Amazing. Marshall served for Chief Justice for 34 years and is credited with building the court into the influential institution it is today, including as the architect of Marbury versus Madison, the 1803 case in which the court spelled out the power of judicial review, the authority of the court to overturn acts of Congress antithetical to the Constitution. Today, the Supreme Court renders approximately 75 opinions after argument every year. There were only 62 this term, down from 150 just 30 years ago. But 75, 60, a number of opinions every year that affect nearly every aspect of our lives. In the past few years alone, I went back through the Supreme Court's decisions Just in the past few years, these have included the death penalty, voting rights, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion, congressional redistricting, searches and seizures, arrests, trials, separation of powers, marriage, child custody, property rights, elections, campaign finance, treaties, abortions, class actions, foreign sovereign immunity, and of course, the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, plus the usual diet of cases interpreting federal laws governing antitrust, intellectual property, securities, the environment, taxation, ERISA, and many other statutes and laws. I could go on and on. All of those things, if you think about all of those things, have something to do with every single one of you. It is difficult to imagine what this nation would be like today without the landmark decisions of the Supreme Court. You heard Professor Amar describe many of them yesterday in his brilliant lecture. The court gave us the concept of one person, one vote in legislative elections, changing forever the manner in which this nation is governed. Without the Supreme Court, we would not have a constitutional right to abortion, desegregated schools, interracial marriage, the exclusionary rule in criminal cases, the right of the press to be free from prior restraints, the right to decline to salute the flag or pray in public schools, the right to gay marriage, and the individual right to bear arms. And again, I could go on and on. It is possible, I suppose, that some of these developments may have occurred as a result of congressional enactments or some form of presidential directive, but surely not all of them, and who knows when. Now, admittedly, there is widespread disagreement in this country about the wisdom, correctness, or prudence of some Supreme Court decisions. And the court has been sadly wrong from time to time. Examples of grave mistakes include Dred Scott holding that slaves were property and could not become citizens, Plessy versus Ferguson upholding separate but equal racial policies, and Korematsu allowing the federal government to confine Japanese Americans in prison camps. In addition to certain glaring examples of the court making wrong decisions, our citizens disagree freely and vigorously about the correctness of many of the court's decisions, especially those 15 to 25 decisions each year that are produced by 5-4 majorities. Yet the court is respected by most Americans, and its decisions accepted as the law of the land. The justices may have individual predilections, judicial philosophies, and perspectives on their role as judges, and disparate views of the Constitution. But the court is truly independent and incorruptible, the envy of peoples throughout the world. Whatever one's view of the court's decisions on abortion, gun ownership, the 2000 presidential election, I have to mention that, campaign finance, most Americans would not change the Supreme Court or trade in the Supreme Court as it has historically functioned for any other construct. There have been only 113 justices and 17 chief justices in our nation's 228-year history. Think of that. That amounts to a vacancy and a new justice on an average only every 2 years or so. And that statistic is misleading because George Washington appointed 11 justices, including 2 chief justices. Jimmy Carter had no appointments. Justice Breyer was the junior justice, so there had been no appointments for over 11 years. So a vacancy on the court is unusual, unpredictable, and an historic occurrence. Inevitably, to come back to the topic of this week, a tipping point in some respect every time a new justice is appointed to the court. Justices are regularly being appointed at a relatively young age. The last 5 justices have been in their early 50s, and justices now tend to serve for 25 years before leaving the court at an age of approximately 80 years. Sometimes they're older than that. Thus, individual justices may serve for 5 or 6 presidential terms before they leave the court. The significance of these statistics is obvious in terms of the influence and power of individual justices on the laws of this country and the structure of our government. As one of 9, a justice can often be the tipping point in any of the 20 or 25 closely divided decisions the court renders every year. And in other cases, through their concurring and dissenting opinions or their influence in the conference of the justices, each justice has the capability of influencing the court's direction for a generation or more, and thus our government, our society, and the way we live our lives. As Professor Amar said yesterday, the ghosts of presidents past live on for a long time on the Supreme Court. I want to address today what I perceive as the most serious concern for the court and its independence today. That being what has become of the process of nominating and appointing justices. The initial nomination by the president, followed by the Senate's advice and consent process, an elaborate, lengthy, and onerous ritual which could be called search and destroy rather than advice and consent. Many of the justices have spoken out about this. Justice Ginsburg was talking about it just last weekend. Chief Justice Roberts mentioned it just a couple of days ago in a speech that he gave in New Zealand. Before describing this piece of dramatic government theater as it has evolved during the past century, particularly the last 20 years, I will take a moment to describe what the authors of the Constitution intended in the first place and what it generally looked like for the first 3/4 of our nation's history. As you know, the Constitution provides that the President shall nominate and by and with the consent and advice of the Senate shall appoint judges of the Supreme Court. Note that the Constitution does not say that the President must consult with senators before making a nomination, although that might be well advised as a practical political matter. The President does not have to do that. The nomination comes first, and then advice and consent or not consent in the process. Over the course of history, as many of you know, presidents have frequently been surprised and frustrated with what happens after they appoint someone to the Supreme Court. My God, are they doing that? I didn't expect that. Our independent judiciary turns out, indeed, to be independent of loyalty to or affinity for the president who nominates them. In recent history, Republican presidents particularly have been openly disappointed that their appointees have often joined liberal colleagues in rendering decisions advancing newly discovered constitutional rights, often in support of those accused or convicted of crimes and other liberal positions. Some of you may be old enough to remember, and Professor Amar mentioned this yesterday, those impeach Earl Warren billboards in the 1960s, which were a response to the Warren Court decisions involving civil liberties. President Eisenhower expressed his disappointment that 2 of his appointees, Earl Warren and William Brennan, turned out to be such liberal stalwarts. Similar irritation marked the jurisprudential evolutions of Republican presidential appointees Harry Blackmun, John Paul Stevens, and David Souter. Now, in response to this, because the court's decisions often touch on highly controversial political subjects, presidents and their political allies have increasingly focused on the appointment process based upon a nominee's perceived predilections, what he or she has written, particularly in the form of judicial opinions. Presidents want a higher level of predictability when they make those appointments. There are 8 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court today were federal appellate court judges before their nomination and appointment. Why is that? It's totally different than what it was in the 50s when the Warren Court rendered the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Presidents want to know what it is likely that those justices will do when they get on the Supreme Court. And how can you figure that out? By looking at their record as federal appeals court judges, where they do something similar to what happens on the Supreme Court. So they want higher predictability, and they look at the record. And the more a president carefully chooses a nominee on the basis of perceived politics and judicial philosophy, the more the opposition to nominees has become strident and contentious by the political party opposing the president. Was that the process the framers envisioned? Not so much. Certainly not an intrusive probe into how the nominee feels about previous Supreme Court decisions or how he or she will decide future cases. The method of appointing the principal officers of the government was the subject of extensive debate at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. One group, led by Benjamin Franklin, sought to vest the appointment power in the Senate, fearing that investing the power in the executive would lead to monarchy. The other group, led by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, believed that the executive would be better suited than a group of senators to appoint the officers who implement and administer the nation's laws, explaining, in their words, collective appointments were usually marked by intrigues, deals, and machinations. How right they were about that. As finally adopted, the Appointments Clause, like much else in the Constitution, was the product of compromise. The executive would have the sole power to nominate the principal officers of government, while the advice and consent of the Senate would provide a check against an imperial president. The Senate's role, according to Madison, was to prevent any flagrant partiality or error. The limited role contemplated for the Senate in the process was further confirmed in Federalist Number 65, entitled The Senate Appointments and Impeachments. That essay by Alexander Hamilton is devoted almost entirely to impeachments, with the sole exception of one portion of one sentence that simply reads, "As in the business of appointments, the executive will be the principal agent." It seems clear that the Senate's role was to act as a check on manifestly bad appointments, not as a co-appointing authority. In Federalist 66, Hamilton explained that in providing its advice and consent, there would be no exertion of choice on the part of the Senate. They may defeat one choice of the executive and oblige him to make another, but they cannot themselves choose. In Federalist 76, Hamilton added that it would be improbable that the president's nomination would often be overruled, except where there were special and strong reasons for the refusal, such as favoritism, incompetence, provincialism, nepotism, or cronyism, the top 5 bad things about Supreme Court justices to avoid. Now, there have been some tumultuous confirmation proceedings in Supreme Court justices at various times in our history. President Washington's nominee for the second Chief Justice, John Rutledge, was denounced as insane and a deadbeat and defeated 14-10 in the Senate. A Madison appointee was accused of personal depravity and defeated 24-9. They didn't hold back, in the rhetoric in those days, by the way. And President Grant's nomination of his Attorney General to be Chief Justice was withdrawn in the face of withering opposition in the Senate. Louis Brandeis, the court's first Jewish member, survived a very tense confirmation battle in 1916. But those controversies were exceptions, typically sparked by the individual disputes or intense political tensions between the president's political party and the prevailing majority in the Senate. The process, however, began to become a pitched battlefield with the Bork and Thomas nominations in the late 80s and early 90s. But each of these controversies had unique origins and circumstances, and the process returned to relative civility until reaching its current state, beginning with the John Roberts and Sam Alito nominations in 2005. To provide some sense of perspective to this and to the evolution of the confirmation process since the mid-1970s, consider that John Paul Stevens, nominated by President Ford, was confirmed by a vote of 98-0 in 1975. Justice O'Connor was next, confirmed 99-0. Justice Scalia came after that, and he was confirmed 98-0. Justice Kennedy, 97-0. Justice Souter, 90-9. Justice Ginsburg, 96-3. And Justice Breyer, 87-9. During that period, of course, Judge Bork was defeated, and Justice Thomas was confirmed barely, 52-48. But each of those incidents were unique for reasons everyone can call, peculiar to those individuals. But they were foreboding omens for what the process had started to become. The 7 nominations for the Supreme Court that I named, starting with John Paul Stevens and ending with Justice Breyer, received an aggregate of a total aggregate between the 7 of them of 21 negative Senate votes, an average 3 per justice. The next 5 justices from 2005 to the present received negative votes of 42, 42, 31, 37, and 45 negative votes, respectively. So the average increased negative votes in the Senate from 3 for the period I was talking about to 35 negative votes in the current era. And those 35 negative votes per justice were each the culmination of a long, nasty, and some would say brutal process. It may help to summarize briefly the various phases of the ordeal that the confirmation process has become. We might compare the Senate confirmation process to a modern version of the gauntlet, which in ancient times involved a double file of heavily armed individuals who struck, battered, and pummeled a person forced to traverse the passage between the 2 columns. Today, one part of the gauntlet is the press. In today's digital age, from the moment the nominee's name leaves the president's lips, and often before, the media unleashes a swarm of investigators to delve into literally everything the nominee has ever done in his or her life. Every action taken, every friend made or alienated, every word uttered, whether in public or in private, and everything the nominated has done, or, heaven forbid, written, in his or her life is deemed to be worthy of investigation and attention. No subject is off limits. Ex-spouses, domestic help, tax returns, traffic infractions, financial matters, bank accounts, credit records, property deeds, dating habits, former employees, locker room conversations, pranks, jokes, campaign contributions, long-forgotten memoranda, or in today's world, God forbid, email, test scores, pharmaceuticals consumed years ago, fraternities or club memberships, medical records, associations formed or joined. No fact or rumor is verboten, no matter how dated, how trivial, how incidental, or even how unreliable. Admittedly, those uninvited, incredibly intrusive investigations occasionally have turned up information that raises legitimate questions about a nominee's character or conduct for office. In 1878, for example, the Washington Press Corps discovered that Grant's nominee, Attorney General Williams, had used public funds to purchase for his own use a horse-drawn carriage complete with a footman and 2 horses. I think that's the 1870s equivalent of a Gulfstream. So the nomination was withdrawn. And more recently, when President Lyndon Johnson named Associate Justice Abe Fortas to succeed Earl Warren as Chief Justice, investigations uncovered unseemly financial dealings by Fortas. The nomination, already weighed down by President Johnson's lame duck status, was doomed. Fortas left the bench and his nomination was withdrawn. Far more often, however, the relentless and aggressive digging has revealed information that, perhaps titillating, has no bearing whatsoever on the nominee's suitability for office and thus serves no public purpose. One might have thought that the all-time low had been reached in 1987 when the Washington Post uncovered and published a list of the movies that Robert Bork had rented at his local video store. Fortunately for him, his taste in movies did not get more racy than apparently The Sound of Music. But what if it had been revealed that he had watched the equivalent of House of Cards or Game of Thrones? I don't watch all these things, so you can only imagine what's out there. And today, when so much of what we purchase is done via the internet, prospective nominees for the Supreme Court are well advised not to have patronized the Playboy Channel or Victoria's Secret or whatever. A newer, much lower standard was achieved 12 years ago when the New York Times dispatched a reporter to attempt to unseal judicial records in order to investigate the adoption of Judge Roberts' two children, neither of whom by then had reached the age of 6 years. If a publisher like the New York Times will do something like this, what will less reputable publications, websites, and blogs stoop to? Would any of you, raise your hands, want that to happen to you? I think I knew the answer to that. Could any of you survive that kind of scrutiny? Don't answer that. There is a simple incentive system at work here. Regardless of the political leanings of the journalist, and anyone with a computer or a website can today claim to be a journalist, there is an immense reward for the Sherlock who uncovers something that creates a stir about a nominee or brings a nominee down. This is what the person will get if you can uncover that information. Recognition, television interviews, spotlights, paparazzi, journalism awards. Think of the California gold rush. Or better yet, think of sharks when there is blood in the water. This is what it has become. Now, the second component of the gauntlet consists of special interest groups whose missions are simple and direct: to defeat any candidate a president they oppose might nominate. They are extremely well financed. They only have one mission. They are answerable only to the people that provide the money for them to do this. Virtually the only restraint these groups recognize is when their demagoguery gets so obnoxious and twisted that even their allies recoil. There was an anti-Roberts television ad that accused Judge Roberts of supporting a convicted bomber and being sympathetic to anti-abortion violence. The ad was withdrawn only when it became apparent that such a blatant falsehood would backfire in Roberts' favor. One group, opposing Justice Souter, called him almost Neanderthal and warned in the Judiciary Committee that if Judge Souter were confirmed, abortions would become illegal and women would die. This was David Souter they were talking about, not the New Hampshire Strangler. Now, if a candidate manages to survive intense media scrutiny and savage interest groups' attacks, the third phase of the gauntlet begins: the Senate Judiciary Committee. I did some research on one of the recent confirmations. The nominee was served with lengthy, multi-part written questions from the committee, which required production of detailed information regarding every employer, business, professional, or nonprofit entity with whom the nominee had ever been affiliated, all degrees, honors, awards, memberships including clubs, working groups, committees, conferences, publications, speeches, panel discussions, outlines of notes, radio interviews, television interviews, clients, cases, opposing counsel, assisting counsel, positions taken in court, judicial opinions, written or even unpublished opinions, the nominee produced 67 single-spaced printed pages in response, plus boatloads of documents. Every word and every answer and every document was examined, dissected, taken out of context, and analyzed. More written questions poured in from 18 different senators. Private meetings with senator after senator. They call those euphemistically, they call those courtesy calls, as if visiting a Komodo dragon in his cage at feeding time was a courtesy to the dragon. Days of televised hearings and reams of additional questions and answers followed. This particular nominee was subjected to 22 hours of public televised questioning over 4 days, approximately 500 questions by 18 senators, each of whom was surrounded by a swarm of eager aides, anxious to ensure that his or her senator would score the coverage in today's newscast or the next day's headlines. By contrast, a deposition under the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure is limited to run 7 hours. But this justice, potential justice, had 22 hours of televised interrogation. During those 22 hours, the nominee was consistently subjected to lectures, speeches, hyperbole, distortions, argumentative preaching, cajoling, importuning, and scornful and sarcastic interruptions. Senators wander in and out of the hearing room. The nominees and his family or her family are forced to sit through it praying for the next bathroom break if they get one. This is true about the bathroom breaks, by the way. The senators don't seem to realize that they have left the room, gone to a vote, maybe to the bathroom, maybe to do what, but the nominee has to sit there and sit there in front of the camera. There were searching inquiries into Supreme Court cases, past, current, or prospective. Every nominee is now asked how she or he would vote in specific cases and draw comparisons with soon-to-be colleagues or long-deceased justices of the Supreme Court. Documents are selectively leaked to the press. I could go on and on. Well, nominees stoically sit through these questions, harangues, and monologues. Senators, if you watch this on television, senators glare, shake their heads, smirk, talk to one another or staffers, grimace, scowl, pout, or sneer. One senator asked Judge Roberts what he would do to right the wrongs caused by Hurricane Katrina. A senator asked another nominee to express your feelings as a man. I'm not asking for your legal views. A senator on a philosophical tangent asked whether life was the opposite of death. I think you discussed that here, but one repeatedly over several days criticized Roberts for having used the word amigos in a White House memorandum 2 decades previously, as if that were suggestive of racial insensitivity. As one commentator put it, with enemies like that, who needs amigos? Senators criticized Judge Sotomayor of suggesting that the court might benefit from the experience of a wise Latina, as if that was some kind of racial or sexist slur. Senators regularly ramble with canned speeches or mumble demented, extemporaneous musings about whatever enters their mind and escapes their mouth. President Lincoln once admonished on the occasion of the nomination of Salmon Chase to be Chief Justice in 1864, "We cannot ask a man what he will do, and if he should answer, we should despise him for it." However, senators invariably ask exactly those questions over and over and over. And those who criticize nominees for not disclosing how they would vote in a complex case take precisely the opposite approach when the nominee from their own political party comes forward. The confirmation does not have to be part reality survival television, part criminal trial, part actors workshop, and part anger management practice. But that is what it has become today. From the founding until 1955, the Senate confirmed 99 Supreme Court nominees. The median number of days for those 90 confirmations was 6 days. The average less than 13 days. Between 1955 and 2005, there were 21 confirmations that took a minimum of 50 days and an average of 52 days. In other words, 4 to 8 times as long as prior to 1955. The most recent 6 nominees spent an average of 107 days in the process, and that number is exceptionally high because it includes 293 days when Judge Garland was denied not only a vote, but even a hearing. The process gets longer and more abusive with each nominee, no matter which president. The notion that the Senate would hold hearings on a Supreme Court nominee, much less commanding the nominee to appear before a televised show in the Senate, was unheard of for much of the nation's history. No nominee appeared before the Senate until 1925, when Harlan Fiske Stone, nominated to be an Associate Justice, appeared at his own request to answer a question about a prosecutorial incident. After that, through the 1930s, the Senate resolved several nominations, including the bitterly contested 1930 nominations of Charles Evans Hughes and John Parker, without requiring a hearing or an appearance by the nominee. Indeed, when Judge Parker, like Judge Stone before him, requested the opportunity to defend himself in person before the Judiciary Committee, his request was denied. He had no idea how lucky he was. By 1939, the Senate was becoming somewhat more insistent, suggesting to Felix Frankfurter that if he refused to appear before the Judiciary Committee, might not be confirmed. Frankfurter relented. He made a 216-word statement which ended with these lines: "I think it should be improper for a nominee, no less than for a member of the court, to express his personal views on controversial political issues affecting the court. My attitude and outlook on relevant matters have been fully expressed over a period of years and easily accessible. I should think it not only bad taste, but inconsistent with the duties of the office for which I have been nominated, for me to supplement my past record by present declarations. That is all I have to say." It should have ended at that point, but he managed to be confirmed unanimously. When William O. Douglas was nominated to the court in 1939, he voluntarily presented himself to the committee for questioning, only to wait outside the hearing room for hours before being told that the committee had no questions for him. That's today's equivalent of being missed by a runaway bus. The change in Senate protocol began in 1955 with Justice Harlan's appointment. It had a lot to do with the court's then recent decision in Brown versus Board of Education. The South, dominated by senior senators, were very upset about the prospect of what this next justice might do on the Supreme Court. Senator James Eastland of Mississippi would not take no for an answer, demanding that Judge Harlan appear before the committee to explain his views on desegregation. Judge Harlan acceded to the request, and the rest is history. That was during the same period of time that the Senate discovered, as a result of the Army McCarthy hearings, what fun it was to be on television. There is nothing like a live television hearing to enhance a senator's name recognition and confer instant celebrityhood. This is the way to convert a career in the Senate to a run for the presidency. And so we find ourselves today with an elaborate, exhausting, enervating spectacle every time there is a Supreme Court nomination, something of a cross between a political nominating convention, a Roman circus with 18 lions and one gladiator, and a public stoning. If the nominee makes the slightest mistake, flippant remark, politically incorrect statement, the lions will pounce and the public will cheer and jeer. Like they say in the crime shows, everything you say can and will be used against you. I suspect that most of the people who have watched this agree that the process on both sides of the political spectrum has been too intrusive, politicized, unseemly, politically disruptive, and immeasurably damaging. Ask any judge whether a nominee should discuss the rightness or wrongness of past court cases that might still come before the court, or speculate as to how he or she might vote in hypothetical future cases without the facts, without the briefs, without the arguments of counsel, and without the views of their future colleagues. I would guess that there would not be one judge in 100 who would say that such a process is appropriate. That is precisely this type of steel-jawed trap into which nominees are now being asked to please place their feet. Every justice I know deplores what the process has become. Most of them won't say so publicly or as forcefully as they feel, but believe me, they hate it, they despise it, and they resent it. The damage is not only to the individual, but to the court itself. The attacks smear each nominee and insult, denigrate, or humiliate him or her in the eyes of the public. Why do we damage the reputations of those who we would put on our highest court, and yet expect them or the court to be respected for their decisions? Our finest citizens are scarred, diminished, or embittered, even if they are confirmed, and the reputation of the court is tarnished whenever its justices are demeaned. Today we have reached a distressing point in the confirmation for Supreme Court justices. As I have mentioned, there have been 6 nominees since 2005. The nominees of 3 different presidents were graduates of Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and Oxford. They attained law degrees from Harvard and Yale. They were nominated by Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. They clerked on the Supreme Court for Justices Thurgood Marshall, William Brennan, Byron White, William Rehnquist, and Anthony Kennedy. Their resumes reflect professorships at leading law schools, clerkships on federal appeals courts, and service in the Department of Justice. One was Dean of the Harvard Law School and Solicitor General of the United States. They served on federal appeals courts in the D.C., 2nd, 3rd, and 10th circuits. They were endorsed by their clerks, judicial colleagues, prominent lawyers on both sides of the political universe. And yet, as I said before, approximately, or on an average, 35 senators voted that they were unqualified to be on the Supreme Court. They were each outstanding nominees nominated by 3 presidents, and one was denied not only a vote, but even a hearing. We have come to the point where senators of either political party will likely vote against any nominee, however well qualified, by a president of the opposing party. A filibuster was threatened against Judge Alito. Judge Garland was denied even a vote. Judge Gorsuch would have been filibustered had the rules of the Senate not been changed. Well, what can be done? Without some powerful, unified impetus from the public, I think nothing is going to change. The process will only continue to get worse, more combative, more retributive, more uncivil, more demeaning to everyone and every institution involved. The public, citizens of all political persuasions, must demand a stop to this mutually assured destruction. During the political refusal of the Senate to consider the Merrick Garland nomination, I authored an op-ed just a year ago in the Wall Street Journal acknowledging Judge Garland's outstanding qualifications and overwhelming respect from everyone who had ever dealt with him, and called for his confirmation and an end to the spiral of destruction that has become inherent in Supreme Court nominations. But I stated that the Republicans would not and could not be expected to end the warfare all by themselves. It had to be a bipartisan pact. These are the words I used then. As unlikely as it might be, Republicans could make Merrick Garland's nomination a turning point. But it cannot be a unilateral ceasefire. This is not the way politics works. If Republicans are willing to consider Mr. Garland, Judge Garland, on the merits, Democrats would in exchange have to commit to consider comparably well-qualified future Supreme Court nominees with the same level of courtesy, decency, and respect when a Republican occupies the White House. I'm continuing with my op-ed, but if this is to continue, prominent Democrats must make a credible commitment to keep their part of the bargain. Senators Obama, Clinton, Biden, Kerry, Reid, and Schumer all voted against the highly qualified John Roberts and Sam Alito. But if they and their colleagues are unwilling to abandon those kind of hostilities in the future, the same ones that they object to now, Republicans will almost certainly be unwilling to relax their unwavering opposition to Mr. Garland's appointment. So this was a public plea for mutual civility and respect in the confirmation, but that and others like it from other people across the political spectrum fell on deaf ears. Not a single Democratic senator agreed to the proposed treaty, and Republican senators privately told me that they never expected them to do so. They were happy that they didn't do so because they wanted to continue to oppose Judge Garland. I'm afraid that this is a pretty clear sign that the playground anytime soon is not going to be taken over by adults. The bitter partisanship erodes our government, our society, our culture, and our respect for our institutions. We are forced to become combatants, partisans. So in conclusion, I will advert to the primitive custom of trial by ordeal. One popular ordeal was called ordeal by water, which involved binding up the accused, tying a millstone around his neck, and throwing him into a pond. If he defied the laws of nature and floated, he was deemed to have been saved by evil spirits and therefore was guilty and taken away to be hanged. If his body obeyed the laws of nature and he sunk, he was presumed innocent and released if he could be dragged from the pool before he had drowned. I think you can see the parallels to the Senate confirmation process as presently configured for Supreme Court justices. Thank you.
What an outstanding way to end our week on the Supreme Court. For those Chautauquans that are leaving to other activities or events, please do so quietly, as we would like to continue with this great conversation with Ted Olson. If you'd like to join that conversation via Twitter, you can do so using the hashtag CHQ2017. So I guess I'll start by saying one of the things that you are most hailed for is your own ability to operate within both sides of the political spectrum. And I noted two extremely well-known cases, Bush v. Gore, and then of course the case that led to the same-sex marriage ban being overturned. How do you think through your own process about the cases that you'll take, and how do you think through that? What is that process like for you as you decide where you're going to throw your own legal mind into the ring?
That's something obviously any advocate has thought about. I work for a law firm, and we are profit-motivated operations, so we care very much about clients that can pay our fees. We also believe, and I do, in the advocacy process, the process by which the best justice is served when people on both sides of the case present their best arguments to judges. And I've talked about this with judges and justices. What they want most of all is proper and respectful, but for advocacy, powerful advocacy on either side, so that they can make the decision of who's right, what's just, and so forth. Now, there are many circumstances where I won't represent a client. If I think that the client is not going to listen to the legal advice that we give, then that client should have some other lawyer providing the legal advice. You have to remember that the first thing that I was told when I was sworn in the chambers of one of the justices as Solicitor General was, he said, "Don't ever, lose your credibility with this court. And it's so important for an advocate to be a credible representative of their client, whether it be the government of the United States or a private client. That means you cannot be pushed into taking positions that are not legitimate positions and not positions that are open and respectful of the process. So I consider all of those things, and I never do anything where I think it's going to be controversial without consulting with my wife. And my partners. I think that it's very good advice. When you do things all by yourself, just because you think it's right or think it's a smart thing or the expedient thing to do, you're probably going to make mistakes. So I have a few people besides, in addition to my wife, that I like to consult with to hear opposing views before I rush into something.
From Twitter, someone asked, could there be another politician as a Supreme Court justice in our lifetime? And the parenthetical Chief Justice Taft comes to mind as an example.
And Earl Warren comes to mind. Chief Justice Taft moved on to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after being President of the United States. Earl Warren, of course, became Chief Justice of the United States. You're Supreme Court of the United States, not Supreme Court. Chief Justice, you're not Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The last elected official, the last person to have held legislative office or elected office on the Supreme Court was Justice O'Connor, who was in the state legislature in Arizona. For the reasons that I've described, I think it's unlikely, because politicians on either side of the political spectrum will have alienated people, will have made statements, will have made promises. Name me someone running for political office that hasn't promised something that they don't maybe necessarily agree with or they can't fulfill. There's too much involved in the political process for a president who's going to appoint somebody and expect them to be on the court for 25 years without knowing pretty much where they're going to be going. The best predictor is an appellate judge, as I said.
So you talked a lot about the nomination process and how that has gone off the rails. If you were asked to develop a nomination process that was less abusive and more civil, what would your process look like?
What I would say is that we have to get people together. The only way this is going to happen if senators on both sides of the political spectrum, and that means the public, because they're not going to pay any attention to what some lawyer or someone else that comes along or a law professor comes along and say, this is the way the process ought to work. Look at the way it worked with Louis Brandeis, and look at the way it worked with Taft, and so on and so forth. They're going to have to listen to the people that elect them. And as long as there's a premium now on being opposed to anybody that the other side nominates, this is going to continue. So people have got to realize, that's why I said in my remarks, mutually assured destruction. This is destructive by either party against the candidates of the other party and the other president. These last 5 people to be appointed to the Supreme Court, Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, Alito, Roberts, and Gorsuch, are extremely fine people. And Merrick Garland was an extremely fine people. So that if people are going to do that to them, to humiliate them, they believe it's humiliating for their family to have to sit in that row right where the cameras are focusing on them and listen to what people are saying about their husband or their wife or their spouse or their best friend or something like that is terribly debilitating. So people are going to have to get together, and I think that there's got to be a process where you pick the leaders of both the Republican and Democratic Party in the Senate and say, this is going to go on. There's going to be a different president and of a different party the next election or the election after that, and we have to have a process that returns to some sense of civility.
Audience member asking you to describe how it came about that you ended up working with David Boies on the same-sex marriage issue after you were opposing counsel in Bush v. Gore.
That's a question I've been asked a lot, and I'm very, very happy to answer it. David Boies and I were on opposite sides of the election battle in 2000 which involved the public and involved politics and involved law, it involved every level of the courts in Florida, every level of the federal court system, from the district court, federal district court in Florida to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta to the United States Supreme Court, 2 Supreme Court arguments over the course of 10 days, 35 days. It was very chaotic and crazy, and we were working very, very hard. David Boies was on the other side. He wasn't the only one. There was fine lawyers. Professor Tribe from Harvard was also on the other side, represented Vice President Gore. And we had, as lawyers, not only to be writing briefs and developing strategy, but we had to get out and talk to the public to explain what our positions were, because each candidate wanted his position to be understood and accepted by the American people. So not only were we advocates in court, but we had to be representatives in public. I watched the lawyers on the other side, all of whom were fine. David Boies impressed me so much because he was able to synthesize the argument for his client and his cause so clearly and so convincingly and so persuasively. I almost found myself nodding my head in agreement until I realized he was the opposition. He's a magnificent lawyer. He was very supportive when the case came out the way it did, and I was nominated to be Solicitor General. David Boies was very supportive in the confirmation process. I will say he didn't convince very many Democratic senators to vote for me, but he tried. And then he came to the swearing in, and we did some things together. Our spouses are both accomplished lawyers. We became very, very close friends. I enjoy watching David and working with him. When I was asked to represent gay and lesbian citizens in California in the Proposition 8 case, I knew, because of my reputation as a conservative lawyer, as the lawyer for Bush and Bush versus Gore, and various other things, that I would be suspect by many people in the gay and lesbian community and other people. What are you doing? Do we believe you? Do you have any credibility? And so I contacted David. I said, would you like to be co-counsel in this case? And I did that for several reasons. A, to get such a brilliant lawyer as a part of the team is a smart thing to do, it seemed to me. I knew that we were going to have to be talking to the public to try to convincing the public that LGBT individuals had a right to the same equality and institutions that the rest of us did, and I knew that we'd be a good team in speaking to the public, and I knew David would be effective, but I also knew that that would cause us, it would get questions like that. What are the two of you doing together? How did you come together? They referred to us as the odd couple, strange bedfellows, which we were sort of not so sure about, but what it allowed us to do is to say to the American people and to the courts, this is not a Republican or Democratic or conservative or liberal issue. This is an American issue. It's a constitutional question.
One of our audience members would like you to explain the value of having a dissenting opinion as part of the Supreme Court process.
A dissenting opinion, that is extraordinarily important, because in a sense it's like the adversarial process, only played out all the way through to the end. As I think most of you know in here, that Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg, who couldn't be much further apart in terms of ideological preferences and jurisprudential approaches, were very, very close friends. And they had served together on the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And they each respected one another's intellect, their fairness, their willing to listen. Justice Scalia, they would be asked frequently, how can you be such good friends of someone on the other side? How can you be such good friends after writing such acerbic dissenting opinions? And she wrote some pretty tough opinions, dissenting opinions also. But they each said they wanted the input of the person who felt differently about something. It's what I said at the beginning. You really learn from the people who have different points of view. He said, she makes my opinions better. She said essentially the same thing about him. They didn't wind up agreeing on much of these very controversial cases, but the input was valuable to each of them in terms of sharpening their points of views and explaining how they felt about a particular issue.
Two questions about the nomination process for Judge Thomas, asking, hearings can reveal important concerns like Anita Hill's testimony. Do you agree the public deserve to hear that testimony and testimony like that?
Well, I think that the public, I guess, it's hard to say the public didn't deserve to hear it. The public was going to hear it whether Anita Hill testified or didn't testify. They were going to read it in newspapers, or they can hear it on radio, and they were going to hear it on television. So there were different points of view and different experiences. Now, I happen to have to confess a very close friendship with Justice Thomas for a long, long time. And so I'm a biased in favor of him. On the other hand, that process had to take place. If those accusations were out there, and they were, the American people had the right to hear them. It's unfortunate how it descended into a very, very contentious and, in some respects, hateful process in his confirmation process, but I can't say that people didn't have the right to hear it.
Should justices have to prove continued physical and mental health to continue their service on the court?
You want me to practice again before the Supreme Court? I don't think that we can ask that. The test in the Constitution is good behavior. It doesn't say good physical health, or it doesn't say good mental health. But there's a self-correcting mechanism. Someone on the Chicago Law Review, University of Chicago Law School Law Review, wrote a piece about 10 or 15 years ago about disabilities in the Supreme Court during the 20th century. There were a lot of those. There were some physical disabilities. Justice Douglas was in very, very bad shape at the end of his tenure. And I could go on and give you other examples. There was one justice who got to the point where he was incapable of making decisions. The justices sort of deal with that. And in the one case, they quit assigning opinions to a particular justice. They used family pressure to encourage people to resign or to move on. But I don't think you can have a justice submit to a physical exam or some kind of mental test, how many questions you can get right. I'd hate to have to go through that myself. But I think that the answer is in the Constitution, and there is a self-correcting mechanism that will take place.
How do you assess the impact or importance of the Senate's move to require only 51 votes to confirm Supreme Court nominees?
I think that that's the way it should be. There are 5 provisions, as I recall it, in the Constitution that require a heightened number of votes in the Senate: treaties, impeachments. I think it's impeachments. There were 2 or 3 other things in the Constitution where supermajority is required. 51 votes are not more than 51. More than a majority is not required in the Constitution for anything that the Senate does. That is a Senate rule. Now, what happened during the previous administration is because the Republicans were being obstructive with respect to appellate court judicial appointments, Senator Reid and his colleagues eliminated the filibuster rule for lower court, inferior court positions, and then, of course, with the Gorsuch thing, the Senate went ahead and did away with it for Supreme Court justices. If you have a supermajority, as much as that allows for greater influence and deliberation by some members of the Senate, you're allowing the minority to decide things, and you're forcing people into situations where a smaller number of people can control the outcome. It seems to me, unless we want to put something in the Constitution that requires that, the Constitution doesn't require it, and I'm happy with that.
So I'm going to end our conversations with 2 questions for you to muse on. One is, can you give us a sense of what it's like to argue a case before the court, given how much you've done that? And a few of our friends in the audience want to know, given what you said about the process of nomination, would you ever be willing to go through it yourself?
I'll answer the latter question first. I told you that people are now in their 50s when they're nominated for the Supreme Court or any other, judicial position, and I'm 76. So that choice is far beyond me, thank goodness. I do think it would be, I have a partner who was nominated for the D.C. Circuit, an extremely well-qualified person. His name is familiar to a lot of people, Miguel Estrada. I have two partners. Miguel Estrada was prevented from coming up for a vote for the D.C. Circuit. It was a very nasty, hurtful process. And he said this time, when someone suggested that he might be a candidate for Solicitor General, he said, I would want no part of that process. I have another partner in New York, on the other side of the political spectrum, Caitlin Halligan, who was also nominated for the D.C. Circuit, was put through the same thing by the Republicans as Miguel was put through by Democrats. I think you really have to be able to be tough, to be able to handle it. And the unfortunate thing is that you better not have taken too many controversial positions. There are lots of wonderful law professors, for example, that write books and articles and take positions on things, and they're putting them out to discuss. They take controversial positions to hear how it sounds so that there can be debate. And if those things are taken literally, that can kill a nomination. So that's sort of part of the process. Arguing before the Supreme Court is a great privilege and a great thrill. We prepare extraordinarily hard for those experiences. The justices are all well prepared. They all, except for Justice Thomas, who has his own reasons for not asking questions. So there's a process by which you are really forced to defend your position, to articulate your position, to think about all aspects, because the justices must decide not just this case, but what does it mean if they decide in your favor in this case for the long run, for other cases. They have to, that's why you hear all these hypotheticals. Well, what about this? Well, what if we do this? And what if we do this? And what will happen here? They have to think about those things before they decide to vote on a case. So we have to be extremely prepared to do that. It's extraordinarily exhilarating, brings a lot of adrenaline to you, and it's a little scary, because you could make a mistake and down the drain goes your whole case. Or when I was Solicitor General, I was worried arguing an antitrust case that by the wrong answer to a question, I could kill 100 years of antitrust jurisprudence right there and not be able to take it back. I argued a case involving a very obscure provision of the Constitution called the Tonnage Clause, which prevents states and municipalities from extorting fines or fees based upon the tonnage of ships. You've probably never heard about the Tonnage Clause because it was last argued in the Supreme Court in 1856. But I had the most darn contentious Supreme Court argument. They were all over me. Each side gets a half an hour, 30 minutes to present your argument and answer questions, except in unusual cases. I was interrupted 78 times in the course of 30 minutes. Well, that's tough, but it's also exciting and it's very exhilarating. And when we escape from the argument, we go out and open up a bottle of wine.
There's so many wonderful questions we'll share with Ted, but please thank him.